It began with the thunder of falling empires. February 15, 1942, the fall of Singapore. The fortress the British Empire once called the Gibraltar of the East collapsed in barely a week of fierce fighting. More than 80,000 Allied troops were taken prisoner. The Japanese army, efficient and relentless, now stood on the threshold of the Indian Ocean, and Australia, isolated and exposed, suddenly felt like the next target. Across the vast stretches of the Pacific, radio silence masked movement. Yet within the cryptic chatter of Imperial Japanese transmissions, Allied intelligence began to detect strange phrases. Southern Expansion, Operation FS, and Southern Resources Zone. Each hinted at an unsettling possibility that Japan's conquest might not end with Southeast Asia, but continue southward to the Australian mainland. In Darwin, a bustling port town turned military hub, air raid sirens became a daily soundtrack. The town had transformed into a staging ground for Allied supply convoys heading north. Few there believed the Japanese could ever reach them, until the morning of February 19, 1942. At precisely 9:58 a.m., the sky filled with the low hum of engines. Two waves of 188 Japanese aircraft, launched from 4 carriers under Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, the same man who had led the attack on Pearl Harbor, descended on Darwin with devastating precision. In less than an hour, the harbor was an inferno. 8 ships were sunk, including the USS Peary, whose crew fought desperately to fire back as bombs rained down. More than 250 people were killed. Soldiers, dock workers, and civilians alike. The bombing of Darwin became the largest attack on Australian soil in history. To many, it seemed a prelude to invasion. Panic rippled southward. Newspapers in Sydney and Melbourne printed headlines of impending invasion, while government censors scrambled to control the narrative. Prime Minister John Curtin addressed the nation. The fall of Singapore opens the battle for Australia. His words captured both defiance and dread. The Australian continent, once seen as distant from the world's conflicts, now stood in the direct path of war. For military planners in London and Washington, the question became immediate. Could Japan realistically invade Australia? Some believed it inevitable. The British Chiefs of Staff warned that the Japanese Navy, if unchecked, could isolate the continent within months. American commanders, already fighting for survival in the Philippines and the Coral Sea, had little to spare. Meanwhile, inside Japan's Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo, debates raged. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, warned his colleagues against overextension. Japan's supply lines were already stretched thin from Burma to the Solomons. Yet within the Naval General Staff, a faction known as the Southern Expansionists argued otherwise. They proposed a bold vision: to sever Allied control of the Pacific by striking at Australia, thereby cutting off American reinforcements, and forcing the British Empire to negotiate peace. Australian intelligence began intercepting fragments of Japanese communications through Central Bureau, a secret code-breaking unit in Brisbane composed of Australian and US cryptanalysts. Among their intercepted terms was the codename Operation FS, a strategic plan to occupy Fiji, Samoa, and New Caledonia. But hidden within these transmissions were subtler hints of a deeper contingency, a southern strike, possibly aimed at Australia's northern coast. Eyewitnesses from the Darwin raid reported sightings of reconnaissance planes flying far inland, mapping roads and airfields as if preparing for something larger. The Royal Australian Air Force scrambled fighters from No. 13 Squadron to intercept them, but most vanished before contact. It was unclear whether these flights were probing missions or something far more deliberate. In the aftermath, Australia's defences were hastily reorganised. Thousands of civilians were evacuated from northern towns. Trenches were dug across beaches in Queensland. The 7th Division, battle-hardened from campaigns in the Middle East, was rushed home to defend what many feared would become the next front line. American B-17 bombers began arriving at bases near Townsville, forming the backbone of a new Pacific Command under General Douglas MacArthur. Yet despite these efforts, the uncertainty remained. Intelligence officers struggled to determine Japan's true intent: invasion or intimidation. Declassified documents decades later revealed that even the Allies were unsure how much of the threat was real, and how much was psychological warfare designed to stretch defences thin. For the men and women living under blackout conditions in Australia's north, speculation was irrelevant. Every distant rumble of engines, every shadow over the horizon, might herald the beginning of invasion. Letters from soldiers stationed in Darwin spoke of sleepless nights and constant tension. One airman wrote, "We're not fighting battles anymore. We're waiting for the next one to find us." As the embers of Darwin smoldered and the nation braced for what might come next, a single question haunted both governments and citizens alike. Was this the beginning of Japan's conquest of the South Pacific? Or the warning before something far greater? The answer would emerge not from the ashes of Darwin, but from the war rooms of Melbourne and Washington, where plans were already forming to uncover Japan's next move. By March 1942, fear had settled like a fog over the Australian continent. The air raids on Darwin had proven that Japan could strike deep into the south, and no one knew how far they might go next. Across the Pacific, Allied command centers buzzed with conflicting reports, intercepted Japanese messages, vague reconnaissance sightings, and rumors of troop movements through the Dutch East Indies. In London, Winston Churchill's war cabinet debated whether Australia could still be defended at all if Japan's fleet pressed further south. In Melbourne, newly arrived American General Douglas MacArthur began assembling what he called the Southern Fortress. Having escaped the Philippines under cover of darkness, he arrived in Australia vowing, "I shall return." The Australian people saw in him a symbol of resolve, but also a reminder of how quickly the war had shifted. For the first time in modern history, the defence of Australia was no longer a British problem. It was now an American responsibility. British forces in Asia were shattered. The Royal Navy had lost the battleships Prince of Wales and repulsed a Japanese aircraft off Malaya. With Singapore fallen, there were no strongholds left between Japan's new empire and the northern approaches to Australia. The Royal Australian Navy began reassigning ships from the Mediterranean to home waters. Destroyers like HMS Arunta and HMS Vampire were now patrolling the Coral Sea, while convoys from the United States carried tanks, ammunition, and food across the Pacific. At Allied headquarters in Melbourne, planners gathered intelligence under conditions of near panic. A report from British Naval Intelligence, dated March 5, 1942, suggested that Japan's next objectives were New Caledonia, Fiji, and possibly the occupation of Northern Australia. It was labelled "Secret, Immediate Action Required." The implications were clear. If Japan seized the northern coast, it could sever Australia's supply lifeline to the United States, effectively isolating the entire continent. MacArthur's Chief of Staff, Major General Richard K. Sutherland, began drawing up what he called War Plan Orange Revised, a contingency plan for the defence of Australia's eastern coast. The Americans would hold a defensive line stretching from Brisbane to Adelaide, while the Royal Australian Air Force maintained a northern watch. Inland, engineers built airfields and storage depots in remote areas like Cloncurry and Alice Springs, preparing for a long war of attrition should the coastal cities fall. Yet, even as these defences took shape, a quieter struggle unfolded behind closed doors. Intelligence. In Brisbane, the Allied code-breaking unit known as Central Bureau worked tirelessly alongside US Army Signals Intelligence. They intercepted thousands of Japanese naval messages each week, many of them encrypted with the complex JN25 code. Among these intercepts, analysts began noticing patterns, references to southern reconnaissance and resource zones that hinted at continued Japanese interest in Australian waters. Meanwhile, Japanese submarines began appearing along the east coast. On May 31, 1942, 3 midget submarines infiltrated Sydney Harbour, attempting to sink Allied shipping at anchor. They managed to damage the depot ship HMAS Cuttable, killing 21 sailors. The attack stunned the nation. Civilians watched tracer fire light up the harbour sky. To many, this was no longer a distant war. It was at their doorstep. MacArthur used the Sydney raid as proof of Japan's strategic intent. He argued before Australian Prime Minister Curtin that the Japanese are probing, testing our defences before they strike in force. Curtin, wary but resolute, authorised the construction of new coastal defences, radar stations, and airfields across Queensland and the Northern Territory. For the first time, Australian soldiers were being trained specifically for jungle warfare, preparation for battles they feared might soon come to their own soil. Behind the public reassurances, however, there was deep uncertainty. British and American intelligence were divided on whether Japan actually had the capacity to invade. Admiral Ernest King in Washington dismissed the notion as logistically impossible. He believed Japan's priority would remain the defense of its new empire, not the conquest of new lands. But British officers, still reeling from the loss of Malaya, were less certain. They warned that Japan's daring made traditional logic unreliable. "They do not think as we do," one British officer wrote in a confidential cable. "They attack where they are least expected." Throughout 1942, rumors of Japanese landings spread like wildfire. Fishermen along the northern coast reported strange lights offshore. Soldiers stationed near Darwin found abandoned lifeboats that no one could explain. While none of these sightings could be verified, they fueled an atmosphere of constant tension. Even decades later, post-war interviews with intelligence officers revealed that some reports were deliberately suppressed, classified as panic-inducing. The growing alliance between the US and Australia deepened in this climate of fear. Joint operations centers were established. American engineers built new bases in Townsville, Rockhampton, and Brisbane, transforming them into logistical hubs for Pacific operations. Australian troops, meanwhile, began redeploying from the Middle East to defend their homeland. By mid-1942, over 120,000 Allied soldiers were stationed on Australian soil, a force preparing not for offense, but survival. Yet for all their efforts, no one knew the truth about Japan's plans. The answers lay locked within Tokyo's Naval General Staff, hidden behind layers of coded communication and strategic deception. For the people of Australia, every day became a waiting game, for invasion or for salvation. As MacArthur's command grew in strength, he began to suspect that Japan's ambitions might not lie in invasion, but in strangulation, cutting Australia off until it starved into submission. Whether this was a deliberate strategy or a fortunate accident of geography remained unclear. What was certain was this: the next battle, wherever it came, would decide not only the fate of Australia, but the entire balance of power in the Pacific. By mid-1942, Japan's war machine was still advancing, but cracks were beginning to show. The empire's rapid expansion across the Pacific had been astonishing, stretching from the jungles of Burma to the far reaches of the Solomon Islands. Yet beneath the veneer of unstoppable momentum, the Imperial Navy was straining under the weight of its own victories. Fuel shortages, supply bottlenecks, and overstretched logistics had begun to haunt Japanese commanders. Still, within Tokyo's war councils, a bold idea refused to die: the notion of taking the war directly to Australia. The idea was not new. In secret memoranda circulated as early as December 1941, officers from Japan's Naval General Staff had proposed a limited invasion of northern Australia, not to conquer the continent outright, but to neutralize it as a base for Allied counteroffensives. The concept became known informally as Operation Southern Cross, a theoretical extension of Japan's Southern Advance strategy. According to later testimony from Japanese naval officers, the plan involved landing a force near Darwin, establishing a defensive perimeter along the north coast, and isolating the continent from American support. The logic seemed compelling at first. Japan had already overrun the Dutch East Indies, gaining access to vital oil reserves and air bases only a few hundred miles from Australia. The islands of Timor and Ambon were occupied by February 1942, giving Japan staging grounds for further operations. In April, Japanese reconnaissance aircraft from Kopang began overflights of Australia's northern coast, photographing airfields and coastal defences. The images, recovered after the war, showed detailed mapping of Darwin, Broome, and even as far south as Townsville, but not all within Japan's high command agreed. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, remained cautious. "To invade Australia," he warned, "is to reach beyond our arm." Japan's industrial capacity was already stretched thin, supporting operations in China and the Pacific. The Imperial Army, still deeply engaged on the Asian mainland, refused to commit the divisions necessary for an Australian campaign. Even so, contingency studies continued, fueled by mid-level officers who saw in Australia both opportunity and danger. Among the most persistent advocates was Rear Admiral Sadatoshi Tomioka, a strategic planner in the Navy's Operations Division. He argued that an occupation of northern Australia could sever Allied supply routes to the Pacific Theatre, forcing the United States to negotiate. His memorandum to the Naval General Staff in May 1942 proposed limited landings supported by air, superiority and naval blockade. The plan envisioned seizing Darwin and establishing air bases from which Japanese bombers could strike further south. The proposal, though never approved, reflected a real anxiety within Allied command that such a move might be Japan's next step. Meanwhile, Australian intelligence began intercepting unusual Japanese radio traffic. Operators at Central Bureau in Brisbane detected increased communication between Timor and Rabaul, both key Japanese strongholds. Analysts believed the transmissions suggested reconnaissance or logistical coordination, possibly in preparation for an expansion of operations toward Australia. Reports were sent to Washington and London, but opinions remained divided. Some viewed the data as circumstantial, others saw it as an unmistakable warning. On the ground, Australian and American troops prepared for the worst. At the newly built airfield in Daly Waters, 200 miles south of Darwin, US Army engineers worked day and night under threat of air raids. Australian infantry dug defensive positions along the Stuart Highway, a dirt road that now represented the final line between northern Australia and the populated south. Military planners feared that if Japan landed even a small expeditionary force, the vast empty interior would make defense nearly impossible. In May 1942, Japanese carrier task forces were already on the move toward the Coral Sea. Their objective, to capture Port Moresby in New Guinea, a stepping stone that would open the door to the Australian mainland. The operation, codenamed MO, represented the closest Japan ever came to testing its southern ambitions. If Moresby fell, Japanese bombers could threaten northern Queensland directly, and invasion contingencies like Southern Cross might suddenly seem feasible. The ensuing clash, the Battle of the Coral Sea, would become a defining moment. But before that battle even began, Allied codebreakers had caught wind of Japan's intentions. Messages decrypted from the JN-25 code referred to Operation MO and a target designated simply as RZP. Analysts in both Melbourne and Hawaii soon realized that RZP meant Port Moresby. It was a revelation that allowed the Allies to position their carrier forces for the first time in direct opposition to Japan's advance. Back in Tokyo, the possibility of an Australian invasion was quietly shelved. Not because the idea lacked appeal, but because Japan's resources could no longer sustain such ambition. The Navy and Army continued to feud over priorities. The Navy favored expansion into the South Pacific, while the Army insisted on consolidating gains in Burma and China. In the end, the debate became academic. The upcoming battles in the Coral Sea and at Midway would decide Japan's fate long before Southern Cross could leave the drawing board. Still, questions lingered. Allied intelligence officers would later find fragments of Japanese operational maps showing landing zones near Darwin and Broome, annotated in red ink. Whether these were remnants of real invasion planning or mere theoretical exercises remains uncertain. Declassified reports from the 1950s reference missing files from Japan's naval archives, destroyed during the Tokyo bombings in 1945. Among them were said to be planning notes labelled Southern Operations, Australian Sector. To this day, historians continue to debate whether Japan truly intended to invade Australia, or whether the invasion was a phantom born of fear, rumour, and incomplete intelligence. Yet in the tense months of 1942, the threat felt real enough. Every radio intercept, every submarine sighting, every rumour carried the weight of possibility. And as the Japanese fleet steamed toward the Coral Sea in late April, both sides knew that what happened next would determine whether Australia would stand or fall. May 1942. The Pacific trembled under the movement of two immense naval forces, converging in the waters of the Coral Sea. For the first time in history, opposing fleets would wage battle without ever seeing each other, aircraft replacing battleships as the decisive weapon of modern war. Yet behind the immediate clash lay something far more consequential: the fate of Australia itself. If Japan's plan to capture Port Moresby succeeded, the southern continent would lie within range of attack, its lifeline to America severed. The battle to decide that outcome had begun. Operation MO was Japan's bold attempt to secure the southern approaches. Its architects believed that controlling Port Moresby in New Guinea would allow the Japanese Navy to project air power across the Coral Sea, threatening northern Queensland and blocking Allied reinforcements. The invasion force, led by Rear Admiral Shigeyoshi Inoue, consisted of two aircraft carriers, Shokaku and Zuikaku, the light carrier Shoho, and a powerful surface fleet. Their orders were clear: neutralize Allied naval resistance, seize Port Moresby, and prepare for subsequent advances toward Australia. But the Allies were listening. In a small, crowded office in Melbourne, Australian and American cryptanalysts at Central Bureau had already decrypted fragments of Japanese communications weeks before the battle. Their colleagues in Hawaii, under the code name Hypo, confirmed the findings. The target referred to as RZP, Port Moresby, was now unmistakable. This breakthrough allowed Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher's Task Force 17, centered around the carriers USS Yorktown and USS Lexington, to sail into position. The stage was set for one of the most suspenseful engagements of the war. The battle unfolded across hundreds of miles of ocean. On May 7th, American dive bombers found and sank Shoho, prompting a jubilant report, "Scratch 1 flat top." But triumph quickly turned to dread. The following day, Japanese aircraft located the American carriers. A series of devastating attacks crippled Lexington, forcing her crew to abandon ship after secondary explosions tore through her hull. Yorktown was damaged but survived. When the smoke cleared, both sides claimed victory, yet Japan's invasion convoy had turned back. Port Moresby was saved. Australia, at least for the moment, was secure. For military historians, the Battle of the Coral Sea was a tactical stalemate, but a strategic turning point. It marked the first time Japan's advance had been decisively halted. More importantly, it exposed the limits of Japan's southern reach. Without Port Moresby, the logistical chain needed for any Australian invasion collapsed. The Southern Cross scenario, once whispered in Tokyo's war rooms, was now effectively impossible. Still, within Allied intelligence circles, unease remained. In the weeks following the battle, Australian coast watchers reported increased Japanese reconnaissance activity over northern Australia. The RAF intercepted enemy aircraft as far south as Catherine. Naval patrols recovered debris from unidentified float planes. Possible remnants of reconnaissance missions launched from hidden bases in the Timor Sea. Each fragment of evidence seemed to hint that Japan had not entirely abandoned its interest in the Australian continent. Meanwhile, in the code-breaking facilities of both Melbourne and Hawaii, analysts stumbled upon something curious. Among the intercepted JN-25 transmissions were repeated references to Operation FS. It appeared to be the next phase of Japan's Grand Pacific strategy, the seizure of Fiji, Samoa, and New Caledonia. But some decrypted segments mentioned an even more cryptic phrase: Southern Perimeter, Secondary Objective. The phrase appeared only 3 times before disappearing entirely from Japanese communications. Its meaning remains unknown to this day. One officer in Central Bureau, Lieutenant Eric Nave, later wrote in his diary, "The Japanese do not speak plainly. What they omit is often what matters most." His team believed that secondary objective referred to reconnaissance operations directed at the Australian coast. Insurance, perhaps, for a plan that was never fully cancelled. But with the focus shifting toward Midway, those investigations were quietly deprioritized. Back in Tokyo, the Naval General Staff faced grim realities. The Coral Sea had cost Japan irreplaceable aircraft and veteran crews. Oil reserves were dwindling faster than expected, and the Imperial Army refused to release additional troops for a southern invasion. Still, the fantasy of striking at Australia persisted among some planners. It was not ambition that kept the dream alive, but denial, an unwillingness to accept that Japan's expansion had reached its natural limit. For Australians, however, the war remained terrifyingly real. On June 15th, Japanese submarines shelled the coastal towns of Sydney and Newcastle, firing dozens of shells into residential districts. The physical damage was minor, but the psychological impact immense. Civilians were ordered to dig air raid trenches in their backyards. Government broadcasts instructed families to keep blankets and buckets of sand beside their beds in case of incendiary attack. The sense of being hunted, of standing at the edge of the empire's last line, was overwhelming. By July, intelligence briefings in Washington and Canberra began to paint a clearer picture. Japan's grand design for the Pacific, stretching through Hawaii, Fiji, and perhaps Australia, was unraveling. Yet scattered evidence continued to surface. Reconnaissance logs, intercepted coordinates, and faint transmissions from Japanese naval outposts in Timor, mentioning southern surveys. When the war ended 3 years later, many of these documents would vanish into classified archives, leaving historians to debate their true significance. In the aftermath of Coral Sea, one unanswered question lingered in Allied circles. How close had Japan truly come to invading Australia? The surviving fragments of Operation FS, combined with the mysterious secondary objective, suggested that the idea had not been entirely theoretical. Yet no formal order for invasion was ever found. Perhaps it had been burned in the fires of Tokyo's war ministry as the tide turned. Perhaps it had never existed at all, merely the fevered projection of wartime fear. What remained was uncertainty, and the haunting knowledge that Australia's survival had hinged on a battle fought far from its shores. The Coral Sea had bought the Allies time, but as reports began to filter in from the north, of Japanese troops building airfields on Guadalcanal, the question of Japan's next move returned with even greater urgency. Australia was safe for now, but the war and the mystery of Japan's true intentions were far from over. The summer of 1942 brought an uneasy calm to Australia. A silence punctuated by the low drone of Allied aircraft and the distant thud of construction along its northern coast. The Coral Sea had halted Japan's southern advance, but for many Australians, victory felt hollow. The raids on Darwin had proven how vulnerable their homeland was, and rumours of Japanese reconnaissance flights persisted. Across the continent, soldiers, civilians, and foreign allies prepared for what they feared was only a temporary reprieve. The question on everyone's lips was simple and terrifying. What would Japan do next? Under the direction of General Douglas MacArthur, the newly established Southwest Pacific Area Command began reshaping Australia into a fortress. American engineers worked alongside Australian troops to carve runways out of the red earth in Townsville, Cloncurry, and Cairns. Airfields sprang up across Queensland and the Northern Territory, part of a secret Allied network known as the Brisbane Line, a defensive concept that assumed Northern Australia might one day be sacrificed in order to save the industrial South. The plan was never officially endorsed, yet whispers of it spread through military circles, fueling public anxiety and mistrust. MacArthur's headquarters in Melbourne became the nerve centre of Allied strategy. His officers referred to Australia as the unsinkable aircraft carrier, a phrase that captured both hope and desperation. American and Australian forces trained relentlessly, adapting to jungle warfare under the burning northern sun. Among them were veterans of the Middle East campaigns, men of the Australian 7th Division, who now dug trenches and built observation posts on their own soil. "We're fighting for home now," one corporal wrote in a letter to his wife. "Every shovel of dirt feels heavier." While troops fortified the north, the war beneath the surface grew more dangerous. Japanese submarines began prowling Australia's coastlines, hunting Allied shipping and sowing fear among coastal towns. Between May and August 1942, more than 30 ships were attacked in Australian waters. The most audacious strike came on May 31st, when 3 Japanese midget submarines slipped into Sydney Harbour. Under cover of darkness, they crept past the harbour defences, their periscopes glinting in the moonlight. At 12:30 a.m., one of them fired a torpedo that struck the depot ship HMAS Kootabul, killing 21 sailors in their sleep. The attackers were eventually cornered and destroyed, but the raid left the city in shock. The realization was brutal. The war had truly reached Australia's doorstep. Across the country, civil defence became a national obsession. Air raid drills, blackout orders, and coastal patrols became part of daily life. Families buried valuables in their gardens and painted their windows to block the glow of lamps. In schools, children practiced taking shelter under desks, while teachers read government-issued pamphlets titled, "If the Enemy Lands." The tone was grim but pragmatic. Australia would not surrender easily. Behind the scenes, a series of secret contingency plans were drawn up by Allied command. The most sensitive of these was codenamed Defensive Line D, a plan to conduct a strategic withdrawal from the northern third of the continent in the event of an overwhelming Japanese invasion. Supply depots were hidden inland, rail lines reinforced, and bridges wired with explosives to slow an enemy advance. Only a handful of senior officers knew the full scope of the plan. To the public, the government insisted that Australia was safe, but in private, they prepared for the unthinkable. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, still fighting to hold North Africa, sent cables urging Australia not to overestimate the danger. Yet from MacArthur's vantage point, the threat was real. His intelligence officers believed that Japan could attempt limited landings in northern Australia to disrupt Allied supply lines. Reports from coast watchers in Timor and New Guinea described Japanese reconnaissance flights heading south, while radio intercepts from the Central Bureau in Brisbane hinted at increased naval coordination across the Dutch East Indies. "We are not facing a ghost," one intelligence officer wrote in his report. "They are watching, waiting, measuring our defenses." In response, Allied forces strengthened their cooperation. The first American B-17 bomber squadrons arrived in Townsville, flying long-range patrols over the Coral Sea. The Royal Australian Navy increased anti-submarine operations, deploying corvettes like HMS Bathurst and HMS Warrnambool along vital shipping lanes. New radar stations were installed along the coast, primitive but invaluable, giving precious minutes of warning before enemy aircraft appeared. Even in remote towns like Catherine and Broome, locals learned to recognize the sound of approaching planes and dive for cover. As the defenses expanded, so too did the secrecy surrounding them. Civilians were discouraged from asking questions about military movements or new installations. Censorship tightened, and journalists were warned against publishing reports that might alarm the public or assist the enemy. Yet despite the official silence, the people of Australia could feel the tension rising. Soldiers on night patrols along the coast swore they saw signal flares out to sea or distant lights flashing in code. Most of these reports were false alarms, but not all. A handful of intercepted Japanese communications referred to reconnaissance parties operating near Australia's northern coast. Whether these were small landing teams, seaplane crews, or intelligence agents remains unclear. The details were classified then, and many remain so today. In the midst of this growing paranoia, a quiet resilience took root. Australian farmers donated scrap metal to armament drives. Women volunteered for the Women's Land Army, filling jobs left vacant by men gone to war. Church bells rang on Sunday mornings, not in celebration, but as coded signals for emergency drills. "If they come," one Melbourne broadcaster declared on national radio, "they will find us ready." By late 1942, with the Japanese advance halted at Guadalcanal and Allied strength rising, the immediate danger of invasion began to fade. Yet the scars of that fearful year remained. In the trenches carved into Queensland's soil, in the blacked-out streets of Sydney, and in the classified files marked Defensive Line D, locked away in Canberra's archives. The Australian people had stared into the abyss and refused to blink. But as the war shifted northward, and the Allies prepared to strike back across the Pacific, one question continued to haunt those who knew what had nearly happened. How close had Japan truly come to crossing the sea? The answer, buried in fragments of intercepted codes and missing naval documents, would remain hidden for decades, and its truth would be stranger than anyone imagined. By early 1943, the tides of the Pacific War had turned. The Japanese advance, once a relentless wave, had begun to ebb under the combined weight of American industrial might and Allied resilience. The victories at Midway and Guadalcanal had shattered the illusion of Japanese invincibility. Yet beneath the triumphs and official communiques, one mystery persisted. What had truly happened to Japan's plan to invade Australia? Was it ever real, or had it been erased from history as quietly as it had appeared? When Allied forces captured Japanese archives at the end of the war, they expected to find detailed plans outlining an Australian campaign. Instead, what they discovered was a patchwork of references, incomplete maps, coded communications, and memoranda marked Southern operations confidential. Many documents had been deliberately burned or lost during Tokyo's final days. Others were found waterlogged in abandoned naval facilities across the Pacific. The surviving fragments offered tantalizing glimpses into an operation that might have been, and then vanished into the fog of war. One such document, recovered from the naval base at Truk Lagoon, contained handwritten annotations referencing OZ Objective, Northern Approach. Historians later debated whether OZ stood for Australia or an operational codename for the Solomon Islands. Another file, translated by Allied intelligence officers, mentioned Southern Contingency Phase 3. The description was vague, but the dates aligned with early 1942, when Japan's reach was at its height. If the references did point to Australia, they were the only surviving proof that an invasion plan had at least been considered. Meanwhile, declassified Allied intelligence reports told their own story. Australian codebreakers at Central Bureau had, throughout 1942, intercepted numerous Japanese transmissions, mentioning Southern survey groups operating near the Timor Sea. Several references used the term de-operation, believed by some researchers to correspond with what later became known as Defensive Line D on the Allied side. Whether coincidence or counterintelligence, the parallel use of that codename has never been fully explained. Among the veterans who served during those tense months, memories of the invasion scare never faded. In Darwin, soldiers spoke of hearing distant gunfire offshore at night. In Western Australia, lighthouse keepers reported spotting silhouettes of submarines along the horizon, sightings that were dismissed by Naval Command but later corroborated by Japanese records showing submarine patrols within 50 miles of the coast. For those who lived through it, the fear was not unfounded. The enemy had come closer than most dared to admit. As the war ended and Australia emerged battered but unbroken, a sense of uneasy pride mixed with lingering doubt. Government officials downplayed the invasion rumors, fearing they might reignite public panic or cast light on just how unprepared the nation had been in 1942. Classified files related to the defense of Northern Australia, including contingency, plans and intelligence intercepts, remained sealed for decades. When some were finally released in the 1970s, historians were astonished to find entire pages redacted, names erased, and key operations listed simply as not verified. One of the most puzzling discoveries came from the archives of the US Navy. Buried in a report compiled by the Office of Naval Intelligence was a short passage referencing a lost reconnaissance unit presumed down over Arnhem Land, March 1942. No aircraft matching that description was ever identified, but its coordinates fell along a known Japanese flight path from Timor. Could it have been part of an early survey mission for the aborted invasion plan? The report ended abruptly. Further details unavailable, file missing. Even among Japanese veterans, the subject remained shrouded in ambiguity. In a post-war interview, a retired officer from the Imperial Navy's Operations Division, Captain Toshikazu Omae, admitted, "We discussed Australia often, but it was a dream beyond our reach." Others were less forthcoming, claiming that records had been destroyed or that they had been only theoretical exercises. Yet, tantalizing contradictions emerged. Declassified transcripts of war crimes tribunals included one brief mention of proposals for southern occupation discussed in Tokyo as late as May 1942, a period when the Coral Sea and Midway operations were still unfolding. The reference was never explored further. The lack of concrete evidence has done little to extinguish speculation. Some historians argue that Japan never seriously intended to invade, that the logistical impossibilities were too great. Others suggest that the plan was real, but abandoned after the Coral Sea and Midway made it untenable. A smaller group believes something more complex, that Japan pursued a strategy of psychological invasion, using air raids, submarine attacks, and misinformation to paralyze Allied command and divide public confidence. If so, it worked. The panic, the defensive lines, and the evacuation drills all testify to a nation that truly believed invasion was imminent. Today, the mystery endures not only in military archives, but in the landscape itself. Along the remote beaches of northern Australia, rusted barbed wire still lies half buried in the sand. Concrete bunkers, overgrown with weeds, stare silently toward the sea they were built to defend. Local fishermen still tell stories of wreckage found in the mangroves, fragments of Japanese fuel drums, engine parts, or sometimes entire aircraft wings corroded beyond recognition. Whether these remnants are from reconnaissance missions or from something more secret, no one can say for certain. In the end, history's verdict remains cautious. There is no definitive proof that Japan ever issued an order to invade Australia, but there is also no proof that such an order was never drafted. Somewhere between those two possibilities lies the truth. A plan conceived in the heat of conquest, undone by the limits of distance, logistics, and fate. For Australia, the shadow of that plan became part of its national story, a reminder of how close the war once came and how fragile its survival seemed in 1942. As historians still sift through the remnants of codebooks and declassified maps, the echoes of those uncertain months linger in a single, unanswered question: was Australia saved by courage, by geography, or by a plan that simply disappeared?